There is a small town in the mountains of southern Brazil where in the winter of 1947 something happened inside a church that no one who witnessed it ever spoke about publicly again. Not because it was forgettable, because it was the opposite. A woman was brought in against her will, held down by 5 men, and what took place over the next 8 hours inside that sacristy left every person present permanently changed. The windows shattered. The priest who performed the ritual never spoke about it in detail for the rest of his life, and the woman at the center of it all, her name has never been officially confirmed. This is the story of the exorcism of Caravaggio. And it begins not with a priest or a church, but with a curse. The town is Farroupilha, in the Serra Gaúcha region of Rio Grande do Sul. This is deep in the territory of Italian immigration, a landscape of vineyards and colonial architecture tucked into the highlands of the Brazilian south. The people here are predominantly descended from northern Italian families who arrived in the late 19th century, bringing with them their language, their cuisine, their customs, and their Catholicism. The faith here is not decorative, it is structural. It holds the community together the same way the stone walls hold the old buildings. At the heart of this community stands the sanctuary of Our Lady of Caravaggio. The original chapel was built in 1890, a simple stone structure dedicated to the same apparition that had drawn pilgrims to a small town in northern Italy since 1432. By the mid-20th century, the sanctuary had become one of the most important Marian pilgrimage sites in Brazil, drawing hundreds of thousands of faithful every year during the month of May. It is inside the old sacristy of this sanctuary that the event of 1947 took place, and it is in that same room that visitors can still stand today, in a space the sanctuary now calls Livrai-nos do Mal, deliver us from evil. The woman at the center of this story lived in a rural community called Linha Jansen, a few kilometers from the town center. She was a practicing Catholic by all accounts, living an ordinary life in a farming community where faith and daily existence were largely inseparable. But her story had begun years before 1947, at a moment that at the time must have seemed entirely unremarkable. She had ended a relationship, a romantic engagement broken off by her choice. The man she left behind did not take it quietly. According to the accounts recorded and preserved by the sanctuary, the former fiancé said something to her at the end. His words, as documented, were specific. He said that she was laughing now, but that one day she would marry, and on that day something very strange would happen to her. She did marry, she had children, and for a period of years, life continued as it had before. Then things began to change. The descriptions that come down through the documented accounts are consistent and specific. She began abandoning her home without explanation, hiding herself in the dense vegetation along the roads near where she lived. She alternated between episodes of deep melancholy and periods of agitation that those around her could not account for. And there was something else. Something that in the context of a deeply Catholic community carried particular weight. She began to flee from churches, not reluctance, not discomfort, flight. Every time she approached a place of worship, something in her responded with a fear that her family and neighbors described as unlike anything they had seen in an ordinary person. The woman who had once been a regular churchgoer could no longer set foot inside the buildings she had grown up attending. Doctors were not widely available in that region in that era, and the frameworks through which rural communities in the Serra Gaúcha understood mental and spiritual distress in 1947 were not clinical ones. What her family saw, what her community observed, was filtered through the lens of a faith that took the existence of spiritual forces seriously and literally. They brought the case to the church. The priest who received the case was Father Teodoro Portolan, who served the sanctuary of Caravaggio and had become a figure of considerable standing in the community. The decision to proceed with a formal exorcism was not taken lightly and was not taken by Portolan alone. Under Catholic canonical law, the rite of exorcism requires explicit authorization from the bishop of the diocese. That authorization came from Dom José Barea, then Bishop of Caxias do Sul. Before the ritual could begin, Portolan traveled to a convent in the nearby city of Garibaldi. He spent days in confession and spiritual preparation, undergoing what the tradition describes as the purification necessary before a priest can perform the rite. Several of the nuns who would assist him went through the same process. This was not improvised. This was deliberate, authorized, and carefully prepared. The transport of the woman to the sanctuary is one of the most documented aspects of the case, in part because it involved so many witnesses along the route. She was brought by horse from Linha Jansen to Farroupilha. 5 men accompanied her, not as a courtesy, but as a necessity. The accounts state clearly that the strength she displayed during transport was not consistent with her physical condition under ordinary circumstances. Multiple times along the route, she attempted to break free and flee into the vegetation at the sides of the road. The men had to physically restrain her each time. When she arrived at the sanctuary, Father Portolan ordered the doors of the church closed. The community that had gathered outside the sacristy remained there throughout what followed, maintaining a continuous group prayer in the corridor and courtyard. They could hear what was happening inside. They could not see it. Inside the sacristy, the ritual began. What the documented accounts describe over the 8 hours that followed is recorded in the sanctuary's own materials, in regional historical books, including the account preserved in Linha Palmeiro by Herminio dal Agnol de Co, and in the testimonies of those present, including the sacristan Augusto Francesche. She blasphemed. Continuously and deliberately, she directed language at the priest that those present described as beyond what anyone in the room had heard from any person before. She mocked the Latin of the prayers as Portolan recited them, responding to liturgical phrases in ways that suggested a comprehension of the language she had no documented exposure to. She attempted repeatedly to grab the priest's feet, to pull him down, to break his concentration and his physical footing. The sacristan Francesche, in a detail preserved in the historical record, reported that at one point during the ritual, Father Portolan told him to step onto his foot. When Francesche did so, he reported seeing something in the corner of the room that he described but never explained in full. The ritual lasted more than 8 hours. Throughout, the woman had not eaten, had not slept, had not stopped in any meaningful way. And then, toward the end, something shifted. She fell, not violently. She collapsed to the floor of the sacristy as though every force that had been animating her had withdrawn at once. The accounts describe it as a fall without resistance, the body giving out completely, like something leaving. Father Portolan and the nuns assisting him continued the prayers. A consecrated host was placed against her chest. A prayer to Our Lady was said over her. After some minutes, she opened her eyes. She pointed to a corner of the room. She said that the demon was there. What happened next is described consistently across multiple accounts and is the detail that has defined the physical legacy of this case for over 70 years. A cold moved through the room, sudden, complete, and then, as though struck from outside, the windows of the sacristy shattered, not cracked, shattered. In the accounts of those present and those who spoke with them afterward, the breaking of the glass was not preceded by any impact. It was the last thing that happened before the room went quiet. The church's own documented position on what occurred at that moment is careful and specific. The official records note that the demon departed through the window. The glass broke outward, and the woman on the floor of the sacristy, for the first time in years, was still. In the days and weeks that followed, those who knew her reported something they had not seen from her in a long time. She returned to church, and every time she entered, she walked to the altar and received communion on her knees. Now, there is a detail about this story that the sanctuary itself has been deliberate in clarifying, and it matters. The iron bars on the window of the sacristy, the ones that visitors today observe and photograph, the ones that appear twisted and bent at angles inconsistent with ordinary weathering or damage. These bars have become the most discussed physical element of the case, generating decades of speculation about whether they were twisted by whatever left the room that day in 1947. The position of Father Josimar Romeo, the priest who currently speaks most publicly about this case on behalf of the sanctuary, is clear. The written records of the exorcism consistently reference the window and the glass. They do not consistently reference the bars. His statement on this is direct. He says that in the sanctuary's own written accounts, the departure through the window is documented. The twisted bars are not part of the verified written record. They are, as he describes it, part of the legend that has grown around a real event. That distinction is important, and it is the kind of distinction that tells you something about the integrity of the institution that has preserved this story. The sanctuary is not amplifying the most dramatic version. It is attempting to separate what is documented from what has accumulated around the documentation over 70 years of oral transmission in a small community. What is documented is already extraordinary enough. A woman transported by force across several kilometers, held down by 5 men, brought to a stone church in a mountain town in southern Brazil. An 8-hour ritual conducted by a priest who had spent days in preparation. A room full of witnesses who maintained prayer in the corridor outside. A woman who blasphemed in Latin. A sacristan who saw something in the corner of a room and spent the rest of his life not fully describing it. A cold that entered without explanation. Glass that broke without impact. And afterward, a woman who walked into churches and received communion on her knees for the rest of her life. The sanctuary today has transformed the original sacristy into the Livrai-nos do Mal space, open to visitors who come not only from Farroupilha and the Serra Gaúcha, but from across Brazil and beyond. Thousands of people have passed through that room since it opened. They stand in the space where the event occurred. They see the objects used in exorcism rites displayed in cases. They see the window. They see the bars, twisted in ways that the church does not officially confirm were caused by what happened in 1947, but that the church has also chosen not to replace or straighten. Father Romeo, speaking about the case in recent years, has said something that carries weight when you consider the context. He says that the exorcism of Caravaggio is treated by the sanctuary as something serious, that there are elements which are real and documented, and that the church's approach today involves both religious discernment and psychiatric evaluation working together, because the two disciplines are not opposites. They are complements. That last point is worth sitting with, because 1947 was a different era. There were no psychiatric professionals available in rural Linna-Jansen. There was no clinical framework through which a woman who fled from churches and hid in the vegetation along country roads would have been evaluated and treated. What her community had was faith, and a priest willing to spend 8 hours in a stone room with whatever had taken hold of her. Whether what was expelled from that room was a demon in the theological sense, a psychological crisis that resolved through the ritual context of the exorcism, or something that neither framework fully captures, is a question this story does not answer. The sanctuary does not claim to answer it either. What it claims is that something real happened in that room, that the woman who entered it that day was not the same as the woman who left, and that the glass that broke outward at the end of those 8 hours did not break by accident. The old chapel still stands in Farroupilha, the The sacristy is still there. The window is still there. And whatever came out of that room on the day of the exorcism of Caravaggio left marks that a community has been trying to understand for more than 70 years. Some things resolve, some things simply remain. And I want to leave you with something to think about before you close this out. This story happened in Brazil, in a town built by Italian immigrants who carried their faith across an ocean and rebuilt it stone by stone in a foreign land. The woman at the center of it has no confirmed name. The priest who performed the ritual spent years afterward not discussing what he had seen. The sacristan who stepped onto the priest's foot and looked into the corner of the room never fully described what he saw there. So here is my question for you. The sanctuary chose to open that room to the public, to let thousands of people stand in the space where this happened. If you were there, standing in that sacristy, looking at that window, what would you believe? And do you think there are things that happen in this world that exist beyond the reach of any explanation we currently have? Tell me in the comments.